What's happening, kids? Daddykins is back. With the aforepromised Practice and Theory of Bolshevism by not Leon Russell, not Kurt Russell, but the late and great Bertrand Russell. I don't know how great he is, but you know, we'll try to keep up with him. He had some pretty wackadoodle ideas. We'll see. I'll read more of his stuff at some point. I just got one of his books not too long ago. It's called The Impact of Science on Society. Is that right? And we'll crack the seal on that one a little bit later. But this one, I started a while back. And a bit by the late and great Milton Friedman. Guess you can see what side I'm on, huh? Well, let's see, where did we leave off? I think that we went through the Practice and Theory of Bolshevism. I think the first episode we did of that was episode 10. And episode 12 was the last one we did with Capitalism and Freedom. So we will pick up where we left off. And I'm going to have to put my glasses on for that because I'm an old man. I have to wipe them off. Yeah. We're doing it right. His glasses are still crooked. Nothing's changed there. I found these glasses, so it's not my fault. They were crooked when I got them. So, as we pick up on the Practice and Theory of Bolshevism by Bertrand Russell, this present work it's the outcome of a visit to Russia by Bertrand himself. He says he tried to state his impressions without any bias, yet it is clear that he sympathizes with the Bolshevik ideal. He wasn't in Russia very long, and he said they treated him well. Of course, at the time, we didn't know about a lot of the atrocities that were going on there at the time. Well, we didn't. The British had yet to come over and school us on how to do spycraft right. So we didn't know a lot about the atrocities that were going on there at the time. I really need to start drinking coffee before I do this. So he had some representatives smiling and kind of showing him around while masses of unfortunate bastards were rotting and slaving away in gulags all over the countryside there. He states his desired goal to help shape the reader's attitude towards or against Bolshevism, as he considers it a matter of such importance. So everything up to here that we've gone over, including the segment in episode 10, is from the author's own introduction to his book. And now for part 1, the present condition of Russia. Again, written in 1920. He says at the outset that to understand Bolshevism, you have to have an open mind. That the main thing they've done is to create hope, or at least to make it widespread. It turns out that hope was only relegated to a few in Russia. as millions were detained in camps and prisons. Surely Bertrand Russell knew little about this at the time, at least. But perhaps he was not as naive as I'd first imagined. He did describe the hopes of the Bolsheviks as tragic delusions, destined to bring upon the world centuries of darkness and futile violence. Then he goes on an atheistic diatribe about how the teachings of Christ only taught people how to be horrible to each other. A rather cynical view. Then he says that the hopes which inspired communism are as admirable as those instilled by the Sermon on the Mount. That's a blasphemous assertion, to say the least. His point, to grant him a moment of clemency, was that for both, analogously, the intention was good, but the fruit was spoiled by the fanatics who turned them into something terrible and tyrannical. So, all the fanatics? That it's within our nature to be cruel, and that fanaticism is a cover for tyranny. And so to resist Bolshevism should be done in the service of the free spirit of man. Well, yeah. So this is the interwar period, during the time when, in America, J. Edgar Hoover was just launching his war at home against the communists, leading an early instantiation of the FBI and wreaking havoc on the fundamental rights of both our citizens and foreign nationals living inside our borders. You can read about his indiscretions in Tom Weiner's book, Enemies, The History of the FBI. So, Bertrand Russell here describes a war-torn Europe, where disillusionment and despair call for a sort of new religion, which Bolshevism is somehow an answer to. Empty promises of a utopia brought about by the synthesis or reconciliation of dialectically opposed forces. He goes on to give a long, flowery depiction of the communist utopia where everything works out perfectly, and then goes on a tirade about the evils of capitalism, and then rounds it off with a vision of the future where either socialism prevails or we slide back into a dark age of barbarism. On the one hand, he freely admits that Russian communism is a disaster, not even knowing the half of it, and at the same time looks at America entering into a prosperous era of wealth and plenitude. This is the 1920s, and somehow draws the conclusion that the future of the world depends on us just getting communism right. These people have been saying the same thing ever since. Failure after failure and death on an unprecedented scale. Now imagine people on the right literally saying that if we could just get fascism right, then we'd be in paradise. And then staking all of our freedom and our future on that notion. It's incomprehensible. But of course that would never happen, since fascism was an invention of the left, and they're already dedicated to communism. Remember, small government, individual God-given rights, freedom of speech, free market capitalism, and the right to bear arms have nothing whatsoever to do with fascism. The fascism is of the right idea. It is just a big lie to pin the blame on you and claim the moral high ground. No, fascism and communism were just two competing football teams of the same league in the same neighborhoods and with the same audience. They were youth movements who all wanted to recruit from the same pool of disaffected workers and teenagers, basically, to bring about their revolution. They all hated religion. They hated conservatives and capitalism and parliamentary-style government. Socialist revolution is a left-wing concept, period. They're just two different means to the same end, which is not a utopia filled with flowers and men and women sharing bread and healthy, well-fed workers distributing a hearty plenitude of overstock to the needy and everybody being satisfied. Okay? That's a fantasy. Rather, it is a dystopian hellscape where the elite sit in their ivory towers, fat and happy, while they steal the labor and produce of all hardworking, mostly starving people, and then do what they want with it. Trade it to other countries in order to bolster their military, because they're going to need it. So, yeah, at least in capitalism, you've got well-fed people whose labor is being stolen. But under communism, you have starving people whose labor is being stolen. Everyone, save the government elites, are miserable and destitute, just like every communist country that ever existed, now, in the past, and in the future. And somehow, it's all these elitist, intellectual motherfuckers who believe in this shit. It's never a hardworking, industrious, innovative, individualist type. Anyway, so back to the text. Bertrand Russell says the big problem with Bolshevism not working in Russia is mainly due to the fact that there are too many people there who know and remember what life was like when they weren't under the oppressive boot of a communist dictator. You would basically have to get rid of all the adults and raise the children up from within the system for it to even begin to work. It would be like Children of the Corn, except all over the whole country. So communism is basically Children of the Corn. In order to make it work, you'd literally have to foist it onto a bunch of children who don't know any better. Lord Voldemort quoted Lenin as saying something as such. Something like, "Let me teach the children and they will all fall into lockstep," or something like that. So that's great. That's a sure sign of a solid political and economic system, where you literally have a bunch of ignorant, uneducated, underdeveloped, brain-having dependents who only care about unicorns and dinosaurs in order to dupe them into this stuff. Also, communism requires a groupthink mentality. So much for any hope of ever being treated as an individual with civil liberties and such. And this author is a proponent of the system, which he describes in this way. He goes on to say that in the West, the hope of Bolshevism is more flowers and rainbows than it actually is in Russia, because the Western socialists are giving a rose-colored account to their audience. They are not reporting on the harsher realities on the ground and dismissing any lack of success with the movement as being caused by the war and blockades. Their followers are not getting an accurate appraisal of the outcomes, not telling them what the trade-offs are and whether the promises can actually be fulfilled. Again, he reiterates his belief that in the West, we are more likely to get socialism right. He says that some forms of socialism are immeasurably better than capitalism, but that some are worse. I wonder at this point, in 1918, what he thought about fascism. He goes on to say that in order to extricate what is truly Bolshevik from what is seen here in Russia, it is necessary to eliminate certain factors from the equation that were particular to that exact case. Russia was defeated in the war. There were food shortages. Now, what about the peculiarities of just being Russian? The disorder, chaos, and waste. In an inefficient government, which was probably the most efficient representation in Russia. Oh, but wait. The government was overthrown and commandeered by a bunch of revolutionary scumbags, really, who didn't know how to run a country. He cites the intolerance and lack of liberty inherited from the Tsarist regime. Of course, that doesn't even hold a candle to the intolerance and lack of liberty from the communists. See, Bertrand Russell couldn't possibly know or understand the extent of the cruelty and malevolence committed in the arrests, interrogations, torture, detainment, and forced labor later revealed by Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago. He didn't know the half of it. What he saw as Russia's failure in accomplishing the ideals or promises of Bolshevism was not even the tip of the iceberg. He seemed unable to comprehend that all of that flowery bullshit was just a lie, a tool with which to lure their perceived oppressors into slavery. Everything is seen in terms of power with these people. That's all they know. You cannot fight them with reason or real compassion, because their compassion is merely a facade. They only speak the language of power. When you see the entirety of society and the world as merely a system of power dynamics between an elite class and a slave class, then that's all there is. What side of that exchange do you think they're going to want to be on? Then he goes on to say that if there was a communist uprising in England, they would be a lot nicer about it. Yes, we all saw how that played out in South Africa when the British aggressed on the native population there. So he's basically saying that the problem in Russia is that they're Russian, cruel and vulgar, and that they lost in the war. Not like the civilized, polite, and victorious British. See, he's already a social Darwinist. He says that the despotism of the Bolsheviks was inherent in their social philosophy, and that they would have carried that with them wherever they went. Anyway, I'll end it there. Okay, so now for Capitalism and Freedom. Milton Friedman's 1962 manifesto, Capitalism and Freedom, is a declaration of a faith in markets. He argues that capitalism enables prosperity and delivers economic and political freedom, that we should be able to make money and spend it as we choose. He decried the government's growing role in the economy. He felt that they were exacerbating poverty and dependence with all their interference and regulation. Milton Friedman felt that market forces in a competitive system would preclude discrimination. His work remained in the academic sphere until he went public in the early 1960s with congressional testimony and radio appearances. He opposed rent control and other types of paternalistic meddling by government in economic affairs. He felt government should be an instrument through which we can preserve and exercise freedom, and that centralization of power is a threat to that freedom. and that reliance on markets effectively increases prosperity, reduces inequality, and strengthens democracy. He thought we should test out just how small we can effectively shrink the government. Maybe if we did that, we wouldn't find ourselves enmeshed in other people's wars. Friedman wanted to end Social Security and give tax breaks to charitable donors. He thought we should be skeptical about well-intentioned government policies. He thought we should have effective policies on hand and then implement them at a time when they are needed, instead of taking a radical approach. This book, Capitalism and Freedom, marks Friedman's transition into the public square. And the New York Times, in typical fashion, gatekept the project, despite its success. Barry Goldwater recruited Friedman as an advisor during his presidential campaign in 1964. He lost to LBJ. Milton Friedman was instrumental in ending the draft in 1973. Fuck, these glasses are fucked up. He believed that national parks should be operated as private businesses. He advocated for school vouchers and privatization of Social Security, floating exchange rates between foreign currencies, an end to public housing, a reduction of income taxes, a negative income tax to support low-income households, protection of property rights, and an end to capital controls. He argued that the Federal Reserve itself caused the Great Depression. Okay, so now the fourth and final introduction in the book. To the free man, our country is a collection of individuals who compose it, not something over and above them. Government is a tool, not a master. There is no national goal except the consensus of the citizens. What can we do through our government to meet our responsibilities, achieve our several goals, and protect our freedom? We establish government to protect our freedom. The great threat to freedom is the centralization of power. Power attracts corruptible and malicious characters. How do we benefit from the promise of government while avoiding the threat to freedom? We look to the Constitution. Keep the scope of government limited. Its function is to protect our freedom from enemies, foreign and domestic, to preserve law and order, to enforce private contracts, to foster competitive markets. We rely on voluntary cooperation and private enterprise in our activities so that we can ensure the private sector is a check on the powers of the public sector and an effective protection of the freedom of speech, religion, and thought. Government power must be dispersed. The exercise of government power should primarily be local, before the state and the federal. That way, if you don't like what the local government does, you can always move to another local community. Better than having to move to another state or country. Liberals tend to be attracted to centralization of government, ruling at the federal level. They believe it enables them to more effectively legislate programs in the so-called interest of the public, such as transferring other people's wealth as they see fit. But the power to do good is also the power to do harm. And those who control power today may not be the ones who control power tomorrow. Furthermore, what one man regards as good, another may regard as harm. Unfortunately, the drive to centralize and extend the scope of government is mostly led by the very people who will be the first to lament its consequences. But of course they will find a way to blame the other side. Governmental power needs to be limited and decentralized in order to preserve freedom. The great advances of civilization have never come from a centralized government or in response to government directives. Their achievements were the product of individual genius, strongly held minority views of a social climate permitting intellectual variety and diversity. As much as our government today prides itself in its priority of diversity, equity, and inclusion, government can never duplicate the variety and diversity of individual action. At any moment in time, by imposing uniform standards for everything, government could undoubtedly improve the level of living of many individuals and the performance of many local areas, and perhaps even the average of all communities. But in the process, government would replace progress with stagnation. It would substitute uniform mediocrity for the variety required for experimentation which can bring tomorrow's laggards above today's mean. The major theme of this book is the role of competitive capitalism, the organization of the bulk of economic activity through private enterprise operating in a free market, the prerequisite to economic and political freedom. The minor theme in the book is the role the government should play in a society dedicated to freedom and relying primarily on the market to organize economic activity. The rightful and proper label for the political and economic viewpoint elaborated in this book is liberalism. Unfortunately, the enemies of the system of private enterprise have appropriated it to describe what they do, giving the word a very different meaning than what it had in the 19th century or what it has today in much of Europe. The intellectual movement that went under the name of liberalism in the 1700s and early 1800s emphasized freedom as the ultimate goal and the individual as the ultimate entity in society. It was laissez-faire at home, which diminished the role of the state in the economy, thus bolstering the individual. Abroad, it promoted free trade to link nations together in a peaceful and democratic way. Politically, it supported representative government and parliamentary institutions to reduce the arbitrary power of the state and protect civil liberties of individuals. Later on, especially post-1930, the term liberalism came to be associated with a readiness to rely on the state rather than private voluntary arrangements in order to achieve its goals. Freedom was replaced with welfare and equality. The classic liberal considered the broadening of freedom to be the path to welfare and equality. The 20th century liberal considers welfare and equality to be at best a prerequisite to freedom, and at worst an alternative to it. With welfare and equality as a pretense, the modern liberal has resurrected the very statist policies of intervention and paternalism that classical liberalism fought against. In the very act of turning the clock back to 17th century mercantilism, they love to castigate true liberals as reactionary. N.C. Friedman, having died in 2006, didn't live to witness our current state of leftist tyranny, where equality has been replaced by so-called equity, whereby a presupposed notion of unfair systemic discrimination is turned 180 degrees, thus creating an actual instance of discrimination, with the perceived oppressor now actually being oppressed. So, you see, they aren't really interested in divesting the world of racism. They actually implement real racist policies in a reverse construction of what they'd imagined to be the original state of affairs. A sort of revenge policy of payback against the scapegoats they've designated to pay the brunt of their own historical missteps. You see, it was the Democratic Party who fought for slavery, implemented Jim Crow, and hatched the Ku Klux Klan. But they will never admit to that. They will never rectify those sins. They will never condemn their predecessors or uproot the foundations of their ideology, which is first and foremost a racist philosophy. Instead, they project that aspect onto their political opponents and depend on the ignorance of the masses to overlook their very foundation. Their modus operandi is to constantly lie, gaslight, and flip the narrative. Anyway, in economic matters, the change in meaning of the term liberalism is even more pronounced. As the classical liberal abhors centralization and favors parliamentary institutions and representative government, the modern liberal will rig a democratic system to achieve national, and even more preferably globalist, control to cement their ideals into permanent place. They like to infiltrate and monopolize state and cultural institutions and pervert language in order to shift the goalpost into a position that otherwise nobody in their right mind would assent to. They'll take liberal free market capitalism and call it fascism. They'll take a fascistic revolutionary paramilitary gang of thugs and call them anti-fascist. They'll wield racially bigoted public policies and call it equity. They'll adopt a mindset ignoring all the realities of subversion, conspiracy, and espionage and then call it woke. They'll take a singular and call it a plural and insist you do the same. They'll take a man and call him a woman. They'll take a baby and call it a parasite. What won't they do in order to defile the truth? What won't they do in order to defile the truth? Anyway, back to the text. Because of the corruption of the term liberalism, the views which formerly went under that name are now often labeled conservatism. We're not looking to conserve state institutions that interfere with our freedom. We want to conserve the institutions which promoted freedom. The term liberalism should be used to describe doctrines pertaining to a free man, not a transmogrified technocratic slave. Anyway, I'll end it there. Rant over. Yeah, so that was just my little analysis of where I was in the practice and theory of Bolshevism and capitalism and freedom. I wanted to include both of those ideas, both of those books, into one episode because I wanted to sort of contrast them. Because as I was writing my notes for the practice and theory of Bolshevism, I was thinking to myself, well, I'm pretty negative on this subject. And I'm pretty negative on Bertrand Russell so far. He seemed like kind of an idiot who thought he was really smart. There's a lot of people like that in our elite class that we venerate as being these, these grand characters. All these assholes at the World Economic Forum and stuff like that. There's this guy right now who's talking about AI, like constructing a correct religion. This, what's his name? Yuval Noah Harari or whatever his name. That guy is so freaking stupid. And he thinks he's so smart. Like, he just has such a high opinion of himself. And that's a problem with a lot of these just elite cocksuckers is that they think of themselves as like they think that they deserve to rule and direct humanity because they're so freaking smart. That Yuval Noah Harari guy is an idiot. He's just a complete and utter fool. And his whole premise, his whole presupposition to his worldview is just totally bankrupt. It's just ridiculous. Like, I wouldn't put that guy in charge of like a bake sale, much less like anything involving our world or our country or anything. And the other day I got a friend request on Facebook from somebody, and I was looking, I was like, who the fuck is this guy? And I always go to their profile and I scroll down their page, and he had this meme of this Yuval Noah Harari guy and some like quote that was supposed to be inspiring but was totally retarded. And I just like right away I'm just like, delete that request. Like, I'm not adding that idiot. So I've got some books here that I've been kind of throwing around. You know, I'll pick up a book and read like 30 pages of it and then move on to something else. It's really the only way I can read the books I want to read, because I would never have the stomach to pick up Rise and Fall of the Third Reich and read it all the way through. I mean, that would just make me ill. Probably drive you crazy. So I can't really read like that. You know, I've mentioned this before. The Wealth of Nations, I could never read that all the way through. I tried reading the Bible all the way through a couple of years. I can't even read that all the way through. Like, it's just, I gotta take breaks. I can't just read the same thing and just keep going on forever with it. Especially like a 1,000-page book. And I've really been wanting to get back to my studies of Jung. I've read quite a bit of Jung over the years. I started reading Jung when I was like 19 or 20. And the first volume that I had was the basic writings of Jung. And so I read that. And then I read, actually my favorite volume of Jung is the Viking Portable Jung. It's got some really essential writings in it. And so I like that one. Then I had the anthology called Dreams, because he's got like these thematic anthologies. And so Dreams was one that I really liked. And then I just like kind of slowly kind of went out and bought all the collected works, and I have all the collected works now. and then I bought like the complete letters, and then I have the Jung Freud letters, and then I've got the Pauli Jung letters, and then I started buying some of his lecture series. So I've got a really great library of Carl Jung, and I've read several of the volumes. I read a few of the collected works volumes. I've read the Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious. That's a fatty. I read the Development of Personality. And then he had a few one-offs, like what was the one that was about sort of the atomic bomb? I can't remember which one that was. Modern Man in Search of Meaning or something. And then there was Man and His Symbols, which was an anthology of his, like, he wrote one of the essays, and then there were several essays that were written by his disciples, and I read that as well. So I want to get more into his stuff. Actually, the current volume I've been reading is this one here, this Psychology of the Unconscious, which is it's basically symbols of transformation. And this volume, it kind of pisses me off when I read it because it got wet. And so it's like, I don't know, man. The binding on it is messed up, and the pages are messed up. But once I get through this, I can kind of move on, and I'm kind of stuck on this one right now. It's a pretty heavy read, and I've gone through it before. So there's that. I mean, that's what I want to get back to. I haven't read from this one in a while, but one book I have been reading, I kind of got back to this right here. This is an abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago. So this is the entire thing abridged. The original was like well over 1,000 pages, and there's a single volume version of it, but it's mainly been broken up into 3 volumes, the complete version, and this is the abridged version, and it has a foreword by Jordan Peterson. So I have this one that I've been reading, and I also have a complete version, and so I'm kind of reading both. The one book that I was reading today, and I'm finally really getting into this, is Homer's Iliad. I got a really slow start on Homer's Iliad, and I think in one of my episodes I actually summarized the very first chapter, and so I'm taking it further, getting back, but now I'm into it. Now when I read it, it's actually really fun. Like it at first it starts out kind of dense, and it's hard to get started on this one. But once you're into it, it's really, really cool, really fascinating, really fun stuff. And part of the reason I got into this is because I'm starting to get into philosophy a little bit. And so, I got a bunch of volumes sitting right here with me at the moment, but the one volume I'm missing is Philosophy 101. It's one of these 101 series books. Let's see if I can find it. Well, I didn't find it, but there's a 101 series of books. They have a white cover with black lettering, and it looks like almost like a newspaper kind of format on the very front. And they're, it's kind of a small book. And it's just a basic rundown, and they have this 101 series is like, different subjects. And so I have a Philosophy 101, and I've been reading that. And, I kind of got into philosophy just starting to get into it. I mean, I really haven't gotten into it that much, but I got into philosophy through listening to Jay Dyer's podcast, and I have his book here, Meta-Narratives. And I started reading this, and this is another one I've been getting a slow start on. So I started reading this, and then he actually signed this one for me. So check it out. If you go to Jay Dyer's website and buy his books, he sends you an autographed book. So that's pretty cool. What was I going to say about this? So there's references right away to mythology, and so it got me back into reading the Iliad. And then I've got here Great Dialogues of Plato. I started reading this like 25 years ago, and this is a pretty nice volume for being 25 years old. I mean, it's an old paperback, but I think I read the first couple. I read Ion, and what's the other one? Meno and Symposium. So I'd read those, and now I'm reading the Republic, which is probably the most important one. So I'm reading the Republic now. Treasure Island. I bought this for my son. He hates it probably about as much as I hated it when I was his age, trying to read it. And now I read it, and it's pretty cool. When you read the paperback version, it's, I don't know, maybe for some reason just like a cheap little kid's paperback like this, little Signet paperback. It's easier to read than like the bigger one with the big lettering. I used to have the Wyeth Illustrated version, and for some reason it was harder to read when I was a kid. I don't know why. For some reason I just couldn't get into that book. Probably because my dad was making me read it and I just hated it. Now I'm making my son read it and he hates it. But it's cool. It's kind of like, in a way, it's almost like, I would say that it's kind of like a prototype of the Goonies a little bit. Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. I like this. These futurist books. There's a whole futurist series out there, and so Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. My brother read this when he was in high school, and I remember him reading it. And so, I mean, it's a little bit scary, kind of reading it. And it's a lot like that Millennium anthology, the Glimpses into the 21st Century. I mean, that book's like $300, but I actually found it on what is it, internetarchive.org, and so I've been reading it on there. And I found a few other futurist books, the Martine Rothblatt's books on transhumanism and eugenics. And so I've been reading, I started reading Unzipped Genes. It's right here, Fabian Socialism and English Politics, 1884 through 1918. Talks about, mainly I think the main focus of the entire book is sort of more the philosophy of Fabian socialism, but it does give a history of the Fabian Society. Although that the history of the Fabian Society is not necessarily the focus of the book. And then there's the Milner-Fabian conspiracy, which is another one I started reading. And that book starts off with more or less just a lot of polemics about communism and Marxism. And let's see, I read this one, a little slim paperback of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. And it has a nice little introduction by Pauline Maier. And the introduction is, what I wouldn't say it's the gold. I'd say the Constitution is the gold, right? Or the Declaration. But Pauline Maier's little introduction puts it into historical context, which is cool. And, there is a book I have down here. I'm going to reach down and grab it. This one here, Larry Schweikart's Patriots History of the United States. So, this is a fat freaking book. But, yeah, I was reading about the colonial wars between the French and the British, the French and Indian War, and everything leading up to the Declaration of Independence. So, I read through, basically all the intolerable acts and the, basically how the forefathers kind of grouped together, how they sort of found each other, and they had drawn on the philosophies of, Locke and Adam Smith and a lot of these sort of individualist sort of Enlightenment philosophers. And so that's interesting. Everything leading up to the Declaration and the break from the British. Then there's this. I haven't really been reading this too much. I read this book all the way through, and now I'm reading it sort of slowly again. It's Robert Paxton's Anatomy of Fascism. And it's weird. He's on the left. He's of the left. But it's weird. He seems to have certain blind spots, even to his own view on some of this stuff, even though he's like a life dedicated expert to the subject. It's a little bit strange. And then this, I want to do this is Anthony Burgess's The Long Day Wanes, a Malayan trilogy. Okay, so this is a trilogy in one volume. And this is a pretty cool book. It kind of got me interested in the idea of, it made me kind of want to move to Malaysia. I started reading, I was like, man, he doesn't really paint it in the most positive light, like the whole idea of living there. I mean, he basically says it, describes it as being just miserable and humid, and you're just sweating all the time, and no matter what you do, you can't escape the, just like the wretched, just humidity and heat and just your own sweat and your clothes sticking to you. And pretty much all the people who aren't native to the region like hate that. But then there's an interesting cast of characters in that book, and so I'm anxious to do a breakdown of that book. I want to kind of get into that a little bit. There's another one I'm seeing here down here in the corner. So I started reading Niall Ferguson's biography of Henry Kissinger, which is pretty interesting. It talks a lot about his life, and of course, because it's a biography. And then I got this one, finally, Kissinger's Diplomacy. I had got it from the library at one point, and then the library stopped carrying it shortly thereafter. And I have a PDF version on my iPad, but I hate reading PDFs, and it's too long of a book for that. So I bought a hard copy, and I'm looking forward to getting into that. I acquired George Friedman's The Next Decade, which is geopolitics, and that's pretty cool. I read the first chapter and I like it. What else? Yeah, I mean, that's just the stuff I've been kind of into lately. Can't really think of anything else. Yeah, I'm wanting to get more into mythology and philosophy, and I want to get more into geopolitics and history. I want to start getting more into Carl Jung. I need to get back to reading the Bible and finish that up. I want to be able to say I've read the whole thing. I still haven't read the entire Bible. It's pathetic. I finally read the Declaration and the Constitution. I had put that off for so long. I hadn't read the Declaration and the Constitution. I finally read it. I mean, I'd kind of seen excerpts of it. I mean, I basically knew the overview of it, but hadn't actually read it. It's kind of interesting when you get in there and pick through it. But that's things that everybody should read. Everybody should read that. Everybody should read the Bible all the way through, once at least. Some people complain about other people's interpretations of it. But anyway, so, I don't know, that's about it. My back's starting to hurt, so I'm getting old. I think that my episodes are going to start getting a little bit shorter. I don't know, I'm going to start doing some shorter ones. That way I'm not straining people's attention span. Straining my own attention span. But anyway, so that is Practice and Theory of Bolshevism and Capitalism and Freedom.